This is a showcase of Refine and ControlNet on Krita AI Diffusion. It focuses on various ways you can speed up specific parts of your creative process. This includes inspiration and visualization, sketching, line art, coloring, and shading. Of course, if you enjoy doing everything manually, then that's okay too. It's also a showcase of Illustrious. In this case, an SDXL anime-oriented checkpoint called Kohaku XL was extensively retrained on a more particularly curated dataset. This resulted in a unique side branch of SDXL that's very good at illustration, true to its name. While focused on anime, it's very good for any 2D style, including traditional media, and even for 3D or realism in some cases. Illustrious models are currently what I would personally consider the most ideal for doing all kinds of illustrative work. This is due to its high style consistency compared to other model architectures and subcategories. This is especially good if you already use your own LoRa's, trained on your own works. With SD 1.5 and regular SDXL checkpoints, it's always been a bit tricky finding optimal checkpoints to apply LoRa's to. With Illustrious, practically every checkpoint based on it works as intended. However, it also has its downsides. If you use regular SDXL LoRa's with it, they might still work in some way, but not as well as they could. The second downside is that Illustrious isn't as versatile as regular SDXL checkpoints or anime checkpoints like Animation for more general subjects and compositions. The nature of its extensive retraining means it sort of quote-unquote unlearned some things, or rather relearned some things very differently. This is particularly a bit more noticeable in something like product design use cases or in more general graphic design applications. However, this isn't that big of an issue if you do pick up the heckin' pencil and control everything manually. But if you do start your creative process from a base generation, then you could always generate a better composition with one checkpoint, then switch to refining it with a different checkpoint. Krita AI Diffusion recently added better support for Illustrious, especially its specific ControlNet models. It already worked well before, but now it can work even better. You'll have to manually download these separate ControlNet models from the links in the description. You can find more in the plugin's new wiki guide. Once installed, you can switch between SDXL and Illustrious ControlNets using this drop-down in the Style Preset section. And of course, you can also set it as a style preset for faster use. Also keep in mind that what could be considered the quote-unquote optimal model in architecture changes all the time. It also changes depending on your own use case. A year or two ago, I would have entirely sworn by SD 1.5. Then half a year ago, it would have been SDXL checkpoints. If Flux was fast enough, I would probably recommend that much more instead. And currently, I've been getting the best results with Illustrious. In short, the best models will always be the ones that fit your own use case at that point in time, while also providing the best raw pixel quality. Also keep in mind, older models don't suddenly become entirely useless and obsolete, as they will always have their own utility, such as lower video memory requirements. As always, if it works for you, it works. You can search for Illustrious checkpoints, LoRa's, and embeddings on Civitai, since they have their own separate category. You can filter them by this category to make them easier to find. Because they're really a fine-tune of SDXL, the same basic considerations for regular SDXL also apply. This means you can use basically the same settings, and also the same VAE, though it also has its own unique recommended mean positive quality prompt, which you can see here. There's also yet another sub-variation of Illustrious called Noob AI, and another one on top of this called vPrediction, or vPred for short. For regular Noob AI, you don't have to worry or change settings, since they apply mostly the same. However, vPred checkpoints need to be enabled in the style settings using this switch. You can also make a dedicated style preset for them to make them easier to use. For all these showcases, especially ones using Scribble ControlNet, I'm using this particular checkpoint. I found it the best at sticking to the intention of the sketch, giving the best Scribble results. Also, despite being an Illustrious checkpoint, I found it works best with regular SDXL ControlNets. This is something you'll have to test yourself. Some Illustrious checkpoints might work better with Illustrious ControlNets, and others with regular SDXL ControlNets. You can see my main settings here. As recommended in my last video, I have two style presets, one for refining larger details faster, and another that's better for smaller details. And just like every video, I'm using my own LoRa trained on my own drawings. This time it's a LoRa trained using Illustrious as the base checkpoint. It's really a merge of two LoRas, one trained on all my non-AI drawings and another trained on those, and also all my stuff that I've made using my AI workflow. I merged them to make a combined LoRa with a stronger effect than on their own, which is also why I'm using it at a lower strength below 1. I'm also using this helper LoRa trained on outputs from an older SD 1.5 checkpoint. That checkpoint was also a merge of my older SD 1.5 LoRas with some other helper LoRas. I consider helper LoRas as those used at lower strengths and applied for their raw functionality, rather than outright copying a style. For example, LoRas that help getting thicker line art, no line art, flat colors, painterly colors, amongst others. Basically, using them as enhancements to round out features or to help stick to a specific medium. Those are the two main LoRas I'll be using throughout this video. Also, remember that you can tweak the regular refined strength slider and also the control net slider as needed, depending on the results you are getting and the results you want. So to properly begin with this showcase, all these examples start from the same basic principle, that idea you have in your head. It doesn't have to be a deep idea, it can just be a cute anime one girl, or it can be something more artistic and meaningful, or it can be something design-oriented. Really, whatever you intend to make. Now, if you need some inspiration, then Generate can help. Simply roll the dice with a basic prompt until something tickles your brain and you get inspired. It can also help with visualization, for example, if you already have a more clear idea in your head, but want to explore different possibilities or perspectives. Once you have your idea and visualization, or perhaps you already had it, it's time to give it a form. First, you can just do everything manually. You can also start from a sketch. One approach is taking this basic sketch to its most completed stage or close enough to it in the least amount of time. This means getting the most out of just using control nets and/or refine alone. The second approach is taking that sketch up to the exact point where you want to manually take the wheel and continue manually working from there. Both of these can still involve your own manual work as much as you want of it and at any time. In both cases, the Scribble control net is one of the most useful ones. As mentioned in my previous videos, the more detailed your sketch, the better it will be completed. Of course, your sketch can still be very sketchy. For both cases, you have two options regarding colors. The first is letting Scribble add the colors simply by putting them in your prompt. The second is you manually putting those basic colors on the sketch first. Both work, though the second option generally ensures better color adherence. This means the colors you intend will usually stay mostly where you already want them to be. Though even then, I still recommend specifying the colors in your prompt, since it helps with guidance in general. This guidance just means the noise pixels that the AI uses as its actual medium will denoise themselves better around the pixels you want. Remember, diffusion models don't collage at all, they just basically do stuff with noise and pixels. Additionally, there's also a third option of no colors at all, if that's your intention. For example, for a manga panel or a coloring book. In that case, specifying monochrome or line art in your prompt can help. This can also help if you only want to go from a sketch to line art, but more on that in a bit. Now, in either a detailed sketch or just a basic scribble, you can also not use any control net at all, and just use Refine on its own. This also applies to practically all of the other showcases in this video too. For example, in this case, Scribble didn't quite get the intended result, despite a couple of attempts. For this, I found that just refining on a mid to high strength level provided better results. Of course, then, you can also put that result through Scribble or any other control net. Another thing to remember is that the checkpoint you're using as a base, and also any additional LoRas, can also have a considerable impact on the results. For example, you can see this particular case. This first example was made using Scribble with a particular LoRa combination intended for more painterly results. Now you can see the same process with Scribble, but using this second LoRa combination instead. Truly, there are many different ways to approach taking a sketch to your intended completion level. Hopefully these examples can help as a sort of starting point. The more you approach the use of AI with a broader and more versatile art mindset, the better the results and the more possibilities. This means applying traditional art and design principles, and also using all of Krita's tools at your disposal, and even other programs. And of course also your own manual work, instead of just pressing generate over and over. Now, you might not like sketching, but you might still like manually refining a sketch. For example, you might enjoy inking or want to practice it, or might enjoy doing cleanup work. In that case, you might be in need of a base sketch to start working from. Personally, I consider all raw text to image generations as glorified sketches themselves, though you can also generate something closer to proper sketches. For this, you can simply try adding prompts like sketch, sketchy, traditional media, monochrome, and messy lines. You can also look up sketch-related LoRa's and add them to your prompt. Then, once you have your base sketch, simply manually work from there as you'd like. Now, you might like doing everything else manually, except for the line art. In that case, you can take a sketch and complete it just up to that stage. The Krita developers are also looking into adding an official AI-powered feature to make line art from a sketch. It's slated to be released in version 5.3, though it might or might not make it in, and it might even get cancelled. You can test it currently in development builds, though I personally haven't. In the meantime, Scribble can also help with this. Simply use your sketch as the control layer, adding prompts like monochrome, line art, black and white, simple background, and white background. The aim is to get that sketch from various ranges of messy lines into something more defined and ready to be colored. The most important thing to keep in mind is that you don't really need to wait until the AI gives you a perfect black and white result. This means you might get a very good or even perfect result that, however, might have some amount of colors or grayscale in it. Instead of endlessly re-rolling again, you can already use this result. There are a couple of approaches to this, especially in Krita. Here's just one way to do this. First, I would recommend resizing your image to the intended resolution for your line art, or rather the resolution you usually work at. However, I would also recommend not doing it right away. It's a bit tricky to explain right away, mostly because Krita's Gmeek plugin is weird and doesn't let you zoom out. More about this in a bit. Now, desaturate your image by pressing Ctrl and U, or go to Filter, Adjust, HSV Adjustment. Then, since Krita doesn't have more common brightness and contrast sliders, you can tweak the color adjustment curves instead with Ctrl and M. You can also find this option under Filter, Adjust. Tweak the curve until all the grayscale is removed, while keeping the line art the way you want it. This means keeping the lines defined, making sure no lines break, keeping the intended line width, amongst other considerations. Note that depending on how much you crank up the curve, the line art will become pixelated. Don't worry too much about it. It will also give a decent quality line art that you can also further tweak manually, filling in the necessary gaps. I would recommend doing that at this point. Even though the premise of this part is that you might not like doing line art, this will still save you a considerable amount of time compared to doing it all manually. However, this result can also still look better, especially if it's still too pixelated. Open up the filter menu, click Start Gmeek, and search for the stamp filter. Now you might see the reason why you might not want to resize your image right away. If you work at high resolutions, the filter preview in Gmeek will be too zoomed in. This will make it very hard to adjust the sliders and see if the overall result is what you want. In this case, I would recommend adjusting the stamp filter sliders at a lower resolution as the very first step of this process. Lock them in by pressing OK, then undo that result, and do the rest of the previously mentioned steps. For the sliders themselves, I recommend disabling auto threshold and anti-aliasing, then manually adjust the sliders until your line art looks nice and sharp. But you can also experiment with the options. Then simply hit OK to apply. This should give you a nice and sharp black and white line art. However, if you somehow feel this line art is too sharp, you can then go to Filter, Artistic, and Pixelize. Then you can try with low symmetrical values below 10. Despite pixelizing it, in a way, it will also smooth it out, because it's basically doing a form of anti-aliasing. Another alternative is resizing your line art about 5 times larger than your working resolution. Finally, you can go to Filter, Colors, and Color to Alpha. This will remove the white background, leaving you with a nice separated line art only layer that you can start coloring however you want. Of course, you can also skip all the previous steps and just color everything on a multiply mode layer, or just color everything on the same layer, or just one normal mode layer above if you do painterly coloring. You could also skip adjusting color curves and use the stamp filter right away, or not use stamp at all. Again, there are multiple approaches. Now, you might like doing everything else manually except the coloring. While Scribble can also help with this, I would consider Canny instead, possibly also combined with other control nets. You could even do double Canny. If your line art is already exactly the way you want it, I would recommend setting the control net sliders to their maximum. This will ensure that line art stays locked in, only filling in the colors. You can, of course, also lower the control net strength sliders if you don't mind some flexibility. I would also recommend clicking their respective sparkles button and using their resulting control images directly. Then you can do this in two ways. The first is by setting the strength slider to 100% and doing generate with your control nets enabled. The second is by lowering the strength slider to still very high levels and doing refine on top of your line art layer. Both approaches will give you similar, but also different results, and you can pick which one is closer to the colors you intended. Remember the layer order when doing refine, as mentioned in my last video. Then you can also take that result and further refine it with the same control nets if the results still aren't to your liking. For both cases, simply specify the colors you want in your prompt, your hair color, eyes color, clothing and accessories, parts of the background, and basically any part that can have a color assigned to it. Note that due to the current nature of how colors work with diffusion models, you can't really specify very specific color values in a prompt alone. You could try with hex color values and might even get decent results. But colors in general are a bit hit or miss, and it's very hard to get exact and value-perfect color accuracy just from diffusion alone. Even by manually adding colors yourself, they will have a certain degree of variation and even degradation. If your use case needs exact and perfect color values, like in the case for graphic design work in print, then I recommend just doing them manually. However, in most cases where colors don't need to be exact values, the resulting colors will be good enough. Next, you might like doing everything manually except shading. This is basically similar to the last step, except this assumes you'll have done the base colors on your own. The same applies as before. Use Canny and other control nets and either generate or refine. You also have the option of vaguely doing the shading on a layer on top of your colors, then refine that with a control net enabled. Though keep in mind that you might still need to tweak the result a bit, as in any of the previous examples. This means some shadows most likely won't be accurate, and there might also be a degree of color bleeding. For example, the hair color might bleed onto the skin color, or vice versa. I recommend just tweaking these details manually, then doing a lower strength refine pass to integrate the changes. Remember that the checkpoint and loris you use also have an effect on the type of coloring you will get. For example, traditional media-oriented loris can help get their coloring style, watercolors, oil painting, color pencils, amongst others. It also goes without saying that prompts can also help guide this. Also remember that you can do color correction in case your colors shift too much or get degraded. You can also use blending mode layers to tweak or change individual colors. You can see this example changing the color of this part using a color mode layer. Again, a refine pass or two at lower strength and with the right sampler preset, and also maybe with a control net, should integrate these tweaks. Finally, while this showcase and my videos in general mostly focus on drawing 2D cartoon and anime one girls with large breasts, the same basic tips also apply to more general image editing work and even graphic design and anything really. I would recommend Flux or SDXL realism-oriented checkpoints for that type of work. But there are also a couple of realism-oriented Illustrious checkpoints. You might also not like doing any of the previously mentioned steps, but might like doing some sort of post-processing work. For example, you can change the lighting in a picture simply by vaguely adding it in a separate layer with different modes, and then refining. You could also add any gimmick effect, then refine that. The limit of what you can do is really your own imagination. It's all about providing your own human guidance throughout the process, and letting the AI fill in the gaps. In a way, it's also really about you yourself predicting and controlling how the noise will be denoised, which in turn means having a good idea, understanding, and control of how the pixels you placed on the canvas will be smoothed out or completed after pressing refine, and then manually tweaking whatever didn't come out right. Seriously, once you stop wrongly treating image AI as just something that can only strictly reference its dataset and only take parts of it and mesh them together, and start really understanding it as the powerful and extremely versatile super pixel tool it really is, everything will click in your head. The refine button is basically an ultra filter that can blend in details but can also sharpen details, but can also complete lines and colors, but can also be a healing brush, but can also upscale details, but can also give you all the degree of control you want, but can also, in short, the best workflow, at least for me, is draw, refine, draw, refine, draw, refine. Hopefully this showcase was useful in some way. Thanks for watching. Draw, refine, draw, refine, draw, refine, draw, refine, draw.